Welcome back, everybody, to Bible Over Beer. I'm Steve.
Randy. Cheers,
Salute.
buddy. It's been a
Wow,
week since I've seen your pretty face.
my pretty face. Yeah, my face. Now you can see it.
I missed it.
My
I'll be
chin is
back next week.
shrunk. Yep. So we're covering 2 Samuel chapters 9 through 16. Randy thought it was a good idea to do that, which I don't disagree. However,
Thank you.
I find there's a lot of detail in here. I think more. I think we'll still keep it short. I'm going to lead in with a kind of 60,000 foot. The demise of David. He's been built up, and he goes through. He's kind of this 9 is still a build up. How he's defeated Saul and Saul's family, and now we start him back and kind of going back to Saul's family and looking for somebody. But the rest, and he kind of shoots himself in the foot. So I think with that, why don't you take it away?
He's sort of the closest that I think we've come to of like Moses and Joshua. They didn't really do wrong. They just followed, had faith, and but David, I was sort of thinking he was going to be on that level, but now he's starting to take a little bit of a turn. So
Yes.
we're going to start with chapter 9. David and Mephibosheth. How's that?
Mephibosheth. Yeah, Mephibosheth.
Mephibosheth. All right. And that person is, well, no, we're going to find out here in a second. A servant of Saul was summoned to David, and his name was Ziba. And David in verse 3 says, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" So this is David, right? I mean, he still had high regard for Saul because he was God's anointed, and had to basically wipe out his family off the face of the earth. But he's just wondering, hey, is there anybody else out there? I want to show them kindness. And Ziba tells David, there is a son of Jonathan, and we all remember Jonathan. Him and David were like brothers.
Yep.
And his name is
Mephibosheth.
Thank you. And he's lame in both feet. Do we know how that happened?
I think they mentioned something about his servant carrying him dropped them, but I think he was lame before that. So I don't think it goes into it. I'm not certain if it's even important, except for the fact that because of that, I don't think he was spared. Yeah, it was spared the demise of the rest.
I'm curious if he was injured or maybe born that way, So I'm not going to say his name. Steve already said it. He came and bowed down, and in verse 6 he said, "At your service." David said in verse 7, "Don't be afraid." I'm sure he's probably thinking, oh God, why am I here, right? David restored all the lands of Saul to this young man. And he said in verse 7, "You will always eat at my table." And boy, that kid was grateful. Happy?
Yeah, we're gonna do the old expression, hold my beer, though. I'm not certain if it ends that way, but continue. I also wanted to add, he has good right for Paul, bowing down and being afraid. I mean,
sure.
The house of Saul thinks that David ordered all his, people killed, and it wasn't the case. It was foolishness and people's Joab and the other folks, so.
Exactly. And so after he restored this young man's lands, he told his servant Ziba, and Ziba has 15 sons, and David ordered them to farm the land so that this young man can eat and be taken care of.
Yeah, I think Ziba was, he was a steward too, so I think he was already doing this. Now he's got the approval of the king.
He was in charge of all that. So unless you have anything to add to that, that was a real kind of easy chapter. We're on to chapter 10. David defeats the Ammonites. The king of the Ammonites dies, and his son, Hanun, succeeded him. David sent a delegation to express his sympathy on the passing of his father, and I'm sure it says he wanted to show kindness because that young man's father, the deceased king, had always shown kindness to David. Yep. But unfortunately, the Ammonites commanders said to Hanun, does it end with an N or an M?
I have N, but that doesn't,
okay.
As we know, my rating's ugly. So
mine too. That's why I was struggling there. Verse 3, David is spying, is what, kind of a paraphrasing of what the commanders were whispering into Hanun's ears. So they seized David's envoy that he had sent, and they shaved half their beards and cut the garments at the buttocks and
Yeah.
sent them away.
So they're buttocks. So they're walking around with
Yeah.
naked butts, naked asses.
They could always buy some longer clothes, but that half beard's probably going to take a while to grow
Yeah.
back. I mean, everybody had to have a beard back then, I think, right? I don't know if it was for religious reasons or
I think, I don't know, maybe, well, I think it was, yeah, I think there were religious reasons for it. Because they're still upheld in some cultures or some religions, like I think Islam, Muslim.
so. Of course, David gets wind of this and he meets these men and he says, I want you to go to such and such place until your beards grow back and you get your buttocks covered up. So obviously we're heading to war here, right? The Ammonites hired 20,000 Aramean soldiers, 1,000 from Makkah and 12,000 from Tob. David sent his entire army. The Ammonites gathered in formation at the city gates. Joab had plans to, and his men had plans to take them on, and he had his brother Abishai in charge of some other army soldiers that were going to take on the Arameans who were lined up in the open country. So war is about to break out. When Joab advanced, the Arameans fled, and so did the Ammonites, and they fled into the city. Joab returned to Jerusalem, but the Arameans regrouped and went to Halam with Shabak as commander. David crossed the Jordan with all of Israel. David fought, and they fled once again. David killed 700 charioteers and 40,000 soldiers. He also killed Shabak, who was the commander. And that king ended up making peace with Israel. Sorry, that seemed like a sort of
It was,
read there, but I just wanted to kind of get through that.
yeah, I was just gonna say, it was, they prepared for the worst and it ended up, going in their favor quite quickly. So they chased them down and then they become subjects to him. So you're about to get into probably the most famous part that I alluded to in the last video. So
that was actually a very long, drawn out, lots of detail, and I really kind of tried my best to condense it there. Chapter 11, David and Bathsheba. Here we go, people. You're going to see a side of David here you didn't know about. Starts out with it's springtime, and David is walking one morning on the roof of his palace. Must be nice. While he's up there, he sees a beautiful young woman bathing, and he sent someone to find out who she is. Was she just bathing? I mean, bathing bathtubs outside back then?
I believe it was a ceremony. It was a cleansing bath area. He's on the roof, so he's seeing down places that are probably private. But from what I understand, this is there's a reason why that was in there. She was ceremonially clean from her monthly bill, I think, and cleaning herself, which means that she was not with child.
Okay.
Hold on to that thought. So
yeah. So Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite.
Uriah.
David had her brought to him and he slept with her. That was pretty much how it was worded. That was it. No whining and dining, no romance, and he slept with her and then he sent her home. What a guy. She later sent a message to David in verse 5, I am pregnant. Wow. So a month or two's gone by. Continues on that David had sent for her husband, Uriah. Would you pronounce it that way?
Uriah,
thank you. And twice David asked him to go home. So basically, Uriah is out battling. David calls him back. He said, hey, man, you need to rest. Go home the first time. And the guy leaves, but he ends up not going home. He ends up hanging out in the palace with some fellow guards and whatnot. I think David's trying to get him to go home to make love to his wife.
Yeah, he's trying to cover up the pregnancy that he caught.
Okay, that's what I thought too.
So yeah, I'll add stuff too when you get, I'll add some interesting thoughts for myself.
The next night, David's like, "Oh, why did you go home?" He said, "Well, why should I go home and make love to my wife and relax while my fellow soldiers are in battle?" David basically tells him to go home again, and he doesn't. He goes down and sleeps at the gate of the palace with some fellow guards, drinks and whatnot. You want to say something there?
Well, yeah, so basically there's a lot of stuff behind her. I did some research, read the Bible for Dummies, and so remember, first off, Uriah is a Hittite, which I found out was is not a from Israel. So he doesn't believe the same laws. However, David tried to trick him into sleeping with his wife, but according to the Leviticus, as we learned earlier, there's ceremonial cleansing before battle when you're fighting for God, right? You can't sleep with your wives.
Okay.
So this Hittite is following rules that David is, David created the worst sin, right? Two sins, right? He coveted and adulterated,
Right.
two bad sins, and he's the king. And then he tries to cover it up. So and it's so that and he didn't, obviously it didn't work, because what I find strange is and possibly what we've been seeing is they're getting away from the traditions or what God had commanded them. The king is not leading by example. He's leading by the wrong example.
David has been so faithful to God and seems so morally, good and just. And boy, when the devil creeps in there, takes a hold of you, that's it.
Yeah, yeah. I
And
mean,
really, up to this point, no sorrow from David. If anything, he's doubling down on his sin here.
oh, yeah,
So,
absolutely.
so, oh, I kind of lost my place here, Steve.
Also, I want to add, while you're finding your place, I want to add one thing too. It's important to note,
Yep.
for later on, we're going to get to that he got out of bed and was on his roof when he was walking around his roof. The roof is key here because he gets to see all of everybody, and apparently everybody can see him on a high place. So hold that
Okay.
thought, folks, to we'll get to it again.
So he couldn't get this guy to go home to make love to his wife. So David wrote Joab, who was a commander in the military.
Yep.
Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Nice. Then withdraw, so he will be struck down and die. That is cold, man.
He's just escalating to insanity. I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly. It's like zero morals here whatsoever. No
yeah.
morality at all.
Also, I want to add a little bit too. Another thing was pointed out, and I didn't catch it. Maybe you did, but this it starts right out with David and Bathish in the springtime when the king went to war. David sent Joab and the king's men in the whole Israel army. They destroyed the Amalekites. Sorry, I went too far, but the point is David stayed back.
Right.
So he's in the springtime of my loving, Zeppelin song. There we go. But
Yeah.
obviously it has basis of, when things awaken and are, attractive. So he was, had he been in battle where he probably should have been, he might not have gotten in trouble. So
I'm not seeing any consultation with the Lord here. It seems that there are battles where he'll consult the Lord. The Lord says, I will lead the way and I will deliver them into your hands. No mention of that with this battle. You know what I mean?
yeah, and it's interesting too, because it does point back in the Bible of Dummies too about the, and we'll get to this here too, where that phrase references back, but David fighting everybody. So remember how last time he said he'd build a house for the Lord? Essentially God's like, you have too much blood in your hand to build me a house. And then he said, I'm going to build your house. So very interesting, very deep, very, very deep book.
I got you. So Joab did just that. And Uriah was killed in battle. Joab had sent that message to David to let him know, and Bathsheba mourned her husband. After David went ahead and made her his wife, and she bore him a son. So marriage and a son. After she had a little, time to mourn. David had displeased the Lord, and this is how the chapter 11 ends. Gee, I wonder why. Or how he displeased the Lord. Wow. Okay. And somebody has to come and tell him, like he doesn't know himself. So the Lord sent Nathan, beginning of chapter 12. Nathan rebukes David. So Nathan is a prophet, obviously, close communication with the Lord.
Yes.
And Nathan is instructed to tell David about a story of a rich man and a poor man that encounter each other. A traveler came to a rich man, and instead of the rich man butchering one of his many, many sheep or goats or whatever to eat, he took the poor man's only ewe lamb and had that butchered and prepared. And this story David burned with anger upon hearing this. But with that said, in verses 7 through 10, I'm going to paraphrase here. Nathan basically says, "You are that man.
Yep.
I gave you everything." This is the Lord through David. I'm sorry, through Nathan. "I gave you everything. I made you king. You struck down the Hittite and you took his wife." In verse 11, "I will bring calamity on yours and you and your household."
Yeah, so I'm gonna the story, it's a touching story, to be honest with you. I mean, you did a good job paraphrasing. I'm gonna add a little bit of detail just to the
Yeah.
fact that the rich man had many sheep and cattle, and the poor man had one ewe lamb, like you mentioned. And not only that, he didn't raise this; he raised it as a family member. He held it in his arms, and they slept in his arms. So this poor man is all he had, and he loved it like a family member. And
Yeah.
when the visitor came, the king took from him rather than him. And so it was a great parable. I guess is that a parable? I'm not certain if it's a parable. Yeah, I think.
If it's not, I like that I'll pretend that it is.
Yeah, I mean, it
Sounds good.
I think it's a parable. Yeah, I think it's a parable. But it was. I like the fact that the way Nathan, because God told Nathan to tell David this, and David was angry. I mean, this guy must die. Oops, guess who it was?
Yeah.
So
Exactly. I got to look in the mirror every once in a while, right?
yeah, and I want to add too, because this is an important piece. Like remember, we're taking the rooftop. Now we're taking the verse 11. But God will bring you calamity on you. He will take your wives and give them to one close to you. You did it in secret, but I will do these things in broad daylight.
Yeah.
Point number 2. We'll get to that.
Yeah. We are continuing on, chapter 12, verse 13. David, "I have sinned against the Lord." So it finally hits home. And Nathan says in verse 14, "The Lord has taken away your sin, but the son born to you will die."
That's one of those things where you think sometimes life's unfair. I mean, this poor child.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a common debate, and today I'll segue in and out real quick. That's a common argument, even though this was not rape or incest or something like that. But sometimes the child pays the ultimate price in abortion. This, unfortunately, was because of what King David did. This child will be
Right.
put to death. I like to believe, and I do believe that God just takes him to heaven, and because he's still important. Well,
Yeah.
because he was King David's son. So I digress.
Good point, right? Such a
Yeah.
good point, right? Because you got two people, whatever reason, right?
Yeah.
Rape, incest, those horrible things. But in the end, it's the innocence that ends up paying the
Yeah.
price.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that whoever did wrong up here will eventually pay the price, but at that moment, like you said, they pay the price, but I'm hoping, that price ultimately is that they enter the kingdom of heaven maybe sooner than they were supposed to, but
Yeah.
their soul's there. So,
Absolutely.
so I have sinned against the Lord, and Nathan goes on to say, the child will become ill and he will die on the 7th day. And David struggled with this. I mean, he had 7 days where he wasn't eating, he wasn't basically sleeping. He was trying to do whatever he could to please the Lord and maybe get the Lord to change his mind, but didn't work.
I'm so. Are you going to put any details down, or do you want me to rebut?
Go ahead.
So, unlike you, I'm going to say it. This pissed me off about David. He became arrogant. First of all, with Bathsheba. Now he's mourning for the child, and it's not. So I think he truly mourned. But what the problem is, his acts of not eating and wearing the sackcloth and laying on the floor was merely an act, because in chapter 22, when, as soon as he learned that, the child had died,
Right.
which by the way, people were afraid to tell him, he overheard them whispering and asked, he just pops up, goes, showers, does this and goes to eat. So as they asked, why are you acting this way? Because it is bizarre. He went from one extreme to another. And while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. So he's, to me, and again, it could be just me. He's
Arrogant.
he's playing a game, and that pissed me off. I'm gonna be honest with you. I mean, he wasn't showing true remorse. I mean, yeah, he may have been, but he was overacting it, in my opinion. And it's like, you can't fool God. I mean, if we
Right.
haven't learned anything from right now, if we have not learned anything by now,
Right.
can't fool God. So that's my take.
It seems so out of character for him from everything we knew prior.
Exactly.
Sort of like came out of nowhere, and he just keeps doing wrong after wrong after wrong. It just doesn't. It for me. It just doesn't add up. It just doesn't make sense. But
How fast you fall from power, in my opinion. So, or start,
right.
because he's falling. We haven't got there, but he's falling.
Yeah, I mean, the devil definitely had a grip on him, no doubt about it. So goes on to say that David eventually had a second son with Bathsheba. I have no idea what their relationship was like. It doesn't really give you that type of detail. And they named him Solomon. The Lord loved Solomon and sent word to Nathan to name him in verse 25 Jedediah, which means loved by the Lord. So the Lord took the first child as a punishment, I guess you would say. Second son is born, and that son is blessed.
Yep. So the punishment was to David and Bathsheba, David specifically.
Yeah.
Well, both of them, because they both, but she probably couldn't confuse. Now, Solomon is a very important name, and I'm going to go on the assumption that he becomes King Solomon, but we stay tuned to Bible over beer.
Okay.
Get there.
Yeah, good one. Meanwhile, we're going to change course here. Joab fought Reba, who was an Ammonite, or he was fighting the Ammonites, and
The
sent
tangent.
word. What's that?
So the tangent. We go from one. Now we're going. Oh, by the
Yeah.
way, so continue.
And Joab sent word to David that he captured the water supply. David and the army came and eventually captured the city. They took the crown from Molech's head. David took all the Ammonites' towns and made people work as bricklayers. Anything you want to add to that before we go on?
Just they mentioned that he took. Did he take all the crowns? You said, or just the one?
Took the crown from Molech's
Yeah.
head.
So and he placed it. He placed it on his head. That weighed talents of gold, which is 75 pounds. That's a heavy freaking crown, man.
I read that, but I didn't look it up. Wow, what?
Well, it just, if you do the clip notes. So anyway, following with us, you use the Bible app for your phone. It's awesome because it gives indexes and references, and you click that note, it tells you what it means in layman terms.
In order to hold that crown up, you need a stiff neck.
Yep.
Okay.
Wow.
Chapter 13, Amnon and Tamar.
Oh my goodness gracious, this frustrated me, but go ahead.
One of David's sons, Amnon, fell in love with his sister Tamar. And back then, you could marry your sister, right?
So for the record, it is his, so the way they noted it was his brother's sister. So that's a way of saying it's his half sister, because David had many wives. So Amnon was the oldest son.
All right. Yeah, I didn't understand that. Okay, that makes sense. And Amnon had an advisor who was very shrewd, and he advised to him in verse 3, go to bed and pretend that you're ill, kind of paraphrasing here. Tell your father, I'd like Tamar to come and give me something to eat. I want to eat from her hand. And David did that. Went to her and said, I need you to go and make your brother some food and feed it to him. So she came and she made bread. And he invited her over to his bed to sit down and feed him. And then he said, sister, why don't you get in my bed? She said, no, please don't do this to me. You'll take my virtue and this and that. And he ended up raping her. Very sad. As soon as he was done raping her, he despised her. He went from loving her to despising her.
Get out.
That dirty, you know what, right? after she made him bread. Get up
Yeah.
and get out. In verse 15, he said. She left and she ripped her garment, which was I guess the garment was the type of a garment a virgin would wear.
Yep.
Put ashes on her head and she wept. She lived in her brother Absalomon's house, a desolate woman. Anything else you want to add there?
Well, I'm gonna, so no, other than I'll finish it off with David. When David learned, he was furious, but he didn't do anything about it.
Yeah.
And nor did Absalom, but you can tell by the way it was written that he had plans.
Okay. That
Yeah.
actually frustrated me because I'm noticing that a lot in this chapter where, okay, David is mad. Okay, so I want David to do something, but nothing. And then it just moves on to something else. I'm like,
Well, and even a little section there too, when Tamar said, "Don't do this to me, this dirty deed to me," it's against Israel, the laws, number one.
Right.
I mean, it's against anybody's laws, in my opinion. But
Absolutely.
he's like, but they wouldn't deny marriage. Go to the king and ask for marriage, and then he can have his way with her. I mean,
He said that to him. Right.
yeah. So that's. I mean, I don't know if that made me mad more. No, I think just the fact that he raped her was just disgusting. So
Well, the other thing was when she went to her brother Absalom, he said, "Don't take this matter to the king."
yeah, yeah.
Don't bother him with this.
Well, and that's where I got at. So he wants to, as we will
And
find out.
he had his own plan.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. So has a plan.
So we're in the same chapter 13, but there's a title here: Absalom kills Amnon. Sheep shearers at Baal Hazar and Absalom invited all his brothers to come to this location. Did that make any sense to you? Because these are my notes. They didn't make any sense to me.
Well, so it was a festival of the shear. So it was an annual event where all the people bring their sheep to
Okay.
shear. So they make a big deal out of it. And again, I'm getting it from the Bible, from dummies, for dummies.
And he invited all his brothers who were prince.
Yeah, all the brothers, all David's sons. Come on down. We're gonna have, join the party. It was
When
rude.
we're there, and I kept this part short, Steve, so you can add to it. Absalom had told his servants, that he wanted them to kill Amnon. He gave some sort of a signal, right, to let them know.
Yeah, when he was drunk, basically.
Okay. Then all the kings, after they had killed Amnon, all the king's sons fled. Not sure if the sons knew that the servants were going to do this.
No, the sons did not, and I had to read it a couple times because I'm like, it wasn't the sons that did it, but what
Right.
happened? Like I'm thinking, oh crap, we're next. You know what I mean? Because he kills, so.
Gotcha. Okay. David receives a report that Absalom killed all of his sons, which there you go. These guys are thinking we're next. We got to get out of here. So that's the report that gets back to David, which ends up not being accurate.
Correct.
David is then told by someone else that it's just Amnon that was dead, and why it happened, because he had raped his sister. The
Correct.
king's sons all returned and wept with David. Absalom fled to Geshur and stayed 3 years. David longed to see Absalom. Now he knew about the rape, but was he being forgiving in this moment? Because he thought maybe it was just what Absalom had done.
Yeah, I think I mean, I take it. Yeah, I think he was fighting the fact he didn't do anything. Now, again, remember, judgment of, we think it's horrible, and I still think they obviously thought it was horrible too. But women didn't have a high rank back in the day. So, but
Yeah,
yeah.
very, very little worth, I guess, right?
Well, I mean, that's an assumption, so it's not meant to offend. So it's just meant that I think, I don't. I just know that yes, you're right. He was riding that knife's edge. I should have done something. Absalom did something. He was my second. I mean, he was, as we'll learn, he was a very handsome man, and
Whether or not they had I know saying no worth is harsh, but I mean, sons were definitely here and daughters were here.
Oh, yeah. In the time, yes, that's for sure.
Chapter 14, Absalom returns to Jerusalem. So remember, 3 years have gone by. Joab knew David's heart longed for Absalom. He had a wise woman brought from Tekoa and told her in verse 2, pretend you are in mourning and put these words into the mouth. I'll put these words into your mouth to speak to David. So she goes on to, I guess, tell this fake story to David, right? Back then, David was a judge. So you would bring your conflicts or
He was the
whatever.
king. Yeah, so he did, yeah, he took the role of judge and king, and
So long story, but I'll keep it short. She asked for his help. She had two sons, she explained. One killed the other in an argument. The whole clan wants to put the murderer to death, her only son at this point. That would mean that her dead husband would have no heir and his name would die, basically, at that point. David said in verse 11, as surely as the Lord lives, not one hair on your son's head will fall to the ground. So it's interesting because murder is a big no-no, I think. But David's willing, for the sake of this woman and for the sake of her deceased husband, to just let this slide. Thought that was interesting.
well, yeah, I mean, I thought it was a lot to do with why didn't Joab just kind of say, dude, you missed your son, go get him. But I think the way it worked, just
Yeah.
like we learned about the rich man and the poor man, right? You need to approach these people differently. And I find it interesting because he's I'm losing faith that David is bright. I'll just say that, and I know I'm completely wrong, but just the parable so close to the fact that he doesn't want to be alone.
Right.
It's his, this is woman's kids. She already is a widow. Now she only has two boys. One boy killed the other. Don't take the last one from me, because then we have nothing. I have nothing. My husband's lineage has nothing. So,
Right.
anyways, I thought it was weird too that they went out of the way to do that. But I mean, there was
Yeah.
a reason for it. So I
Different.
digress.
So she went on to disclose why she was really there, because David had banished his own son for murder. He should bring his son home. Absalom was living with the enemy at this point, correct? I mean, I think the kingdom that he was in was not friendly with David, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
Yeah, I'm not certain. I think the bigger point was he wasn't in David's presence because he feared for his life, and and so
David replied in verse 19, isn't the hand of Joab with you in all of this? So he knew. David knew everything, right? And she said, yes, he is. So he knew that Joab was behind all this.
well,
So
and that's what I was going to add. Is the point is you think he's not that bright? Well,
yeah,
he knew the rouge all along. I mean, he knew somebody's hand in it. So yeah, that's what's kind of weird. So go ahead.
exactly. The king to Joab in verse 21 says, very well, I will do it. Go bring back Absalom. So Absalom returned, but David said in verse 24, he must go to his own house. He must not see my face. And that's exactly what happened. He came home and went straight to his house. 2 years go by. Absalom sends for Joab once, didn't come. Asked for him to come twice, didn't come. So he told his servants in verse 30, set his fields of barley on fire. They had fields next door to each other. And he said, go set his field on fire. That will get his attention, right? Assuming that's what he was basically getting to.
Yeah.
And so that got Joab's attention. And he came back and said, why would you, set my field on fire? And Absalom said, well, I have a message for the king. You didn't come, so I need to get your attention, right? Verse 32, he says, I want to see the king's face. If I'm guilty of anything, let him put me to death. He said I was better off in Geshur than having to live this way. And so Joab went and told the king, and Absalom came, and David kissed his son.
Yep, and I'm gonna add a little bit here too,
Yep.
something that kind of some descriptions on Absalom. So he was apparently very handsome in appearance, not a blemish on him. Um, he grew his hair long, kind of like somebody you've heard of in the past. And no, it
Yeah,
wasn't Randy from the 80s.
yeah, no way.
Wink, 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 wink. It was
Uh-huh.
Samson.
That's right.
But
Yeah.
yeah, he so he would cut it off annually and it would weigh 200 shekels, was apparently 5 pounds. Another
Wow.
note too is add some character to him, how much he cared for his sister. He had a daughter who was beautiful as well, and he named her Tamar. So
Oh,
that's some of the things. But I do see your last point. I would be better off where I was.
yeah.
So
Nice tidbits.
yep.
I like it. We're on to chapter 15, Absalom's conspiracy. Here we go. So he ends up stealing the hearts of the people of Israel. And how did he do this? He would get up early and stand on the side of the road leading to the city gate. Now, remember, people were coming to David to, for problems they were having and judgments and whatnot, right?
Yep.
So whenever anyone would come with a complaint to be heard by the king, he would call out in verse 2, "What town are you from?" And they would answer. Then he would say in verse 3, "There is no representative of the king to hear you." And in verse 4, he goes on to say, "If only I were a judge." Then he would kiss this person. So
He would treat him better. He's conspiring.
inspiring.
Yep. Be careful now. Don't be finishing all your beer. We need
It's
a
just
final
odd
dose.
story, though. What was David thinking when nobody was coming to see him?
Well, so I that's my first thought, but then following up on it, I think that I think what happened is David saw him in whatever answer he gave the people come to see him. Absalom said, "Well, I could have done better." I think that's part of it.
Gotcha. After 4 years, he asked David in verse 7 through 8, "Let me go to Hebron to fulfill a vow to the Lord. If the Lord takes me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron."
What a liar.
Yeah,
Just saying.
flat out. Verse 9, David says, "Go in peace." So he's obviously, well, chapter, conspiracy, right?
Yep.
Absalom sent messengers throughout the tribes of Israel. In verse 10, he says, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king of Hebron." He took 200 men with him. And those 200 men didn't know about the conspiracy.
No, and this guy's smart.
Yeah.
He's putting a snare out to, really convince Israel that he's the
Yeah.
dude.
He is, just decided, hey, I'm going against my father here. The conspiracy gained strength and the followers increased. This causes David to have to flee because he had captured the hearts and minds of the people.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting, just putting something in there real quick. Didn't lead
Yeah.
up to a whole lot of details, just a couple of big events, and all of a sudden, boom, David's fleeing. The king
Yeah.
is fleeing.
Yeah, the king is slain, right?
Yeah.
So David's told, obviously, what's going on. And in verse 14, he says, "Come, we must flee to his household." So he takes the people who want to follow towards the wilderness with his army. He feared Absalom would overtake them, so he needed to get out. The Levites carried the Ark of the God, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until everyone had left the city. David ordered the, oh, God.
No, I disagreeing with you.
David ordered the Ark of the covenant. He told Zodok, the priest, in verse 25, "Take the Ark back to the city." That was the order he gave to Zodok. And so Zodok took the Ark back to the city because David felt that's where it belonged. He said, "If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it again." In verse 26, he says, "If the Lord is not pleased with me, then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. Verse 28, I will wait at the forts in the wilderness until the word comes from you. So, yeah,
I'm gonna add, on his leaving, he left his concubines in the palace to manage it, take care of it while he was gone.
right.
It's an important piece, so go
Yep.
on.
David was told that, oh man, Steve, this name,
Which one?
Ahithophel,
Oh,
was with Absalom. David prayed in verse 31, Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. Now I do remember, and I didn't write it down, this man that he's talking about, who's going to counsel now Absalom, was he a counselor for David?
yes, he was his, yeah,
Okay.
he was a trusted person, at least
Yeah.
originally, yeah. And his name
David,
is,
oh, sorry, buddy.
no, I said his name is fun to say.
Yeah, like we got to come up with nicknames for this. I'm going to call him Al. David
Oh,
and his
yeah.
people arrived at the summit of Mount of Olives. He met Hushai, the Archites there, and David asked him to return to the city and say to Absalom in verse 34, I will be your servant. I was your father's servant. Ask him to, oh, I'm sorry, kind of lost my train of thought here.
No, he basically said,
Okay.
hey, yeah, go back, go ahead.
Yeah, David was asking him to basically spy and tell Zodek, the priest,
He's gonna be as confident.
is confident. And if you hear anything in the palace, it's, good information that I need to know, send Hamez, who was the son of Zodek, and Jonathan, who was the son of Abithair, to me with the news. So anything that would give David some insight as to what's going on there.
Yeah, I think he trusted the two, Ahimaaz, 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 and Jonathan, and Jonathan. Jonathan's
Yeah.
easy, yeah, so. Yeah, so he basically wanted his buddy Hushy to kind of go there and, find out what's going on. Mainly in Hushy, it was important, we'll learn, is he was very good friends with David, so.
All right. Final chapter 16, David and Ziba. David met Ziba near the summit. Oh, I thought this was great. And he brought donkeys saddled with food and wine.
Raisins and fig cakes, yep.
All that good stuff. David asked in verse 3, where is your master's grandson? Now, this is the man that he had bestowed Saul's lands, and he will dine at my table. And Ziba says in verse 3, he's in Jerusalem because he thinks today the Israelites will restore to me my grandfather's kingdom.
So that
replies,
well, so here's this is craziness. Mephibosheth, which is Jonathan's grandson, or sorry, goodness gracious, was Saul's grandson, Jonathan's son,
with the
who
lame,
when we started, with the lame legs, we started with. David told Ziba that he's given him all the stuff. He clearly doesn't believe him, and so he stayed back. And we're going to learn what's the ramification for that. Randy, let us know.
This is great. The way it's just so short and sweet, right?
Yep.
So, okay, so he stays back because he thinks he's going to be crowned king. And David replies in verse 4, just plain out, all that to Ziba, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is now yours.
Yep.
Just
You didn't
like
have
that.
faith in me. No faith in me. Guess what, buddy? You had, because this is a big thing.
Yeah.
Ziba is very loyal and he knows that he's fleeing. So he does. I mean, this is, I'm thinking is a great honor to do what he did. So David is rewarding him for his faithfulness.
Boy, was Ziba pleased. He liked that news.
Oh, yeah.
So we move on to the advice of Haphethel and Hushai. And these are the guys that are going to report to David about the activity in Jerusalem that we already spoke about. So Absalom enters Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. Again, one of the grandsons of the priest, or the sons of the priest. Hushai the Archite said to Absalom in verse 16, long live the king. So obviously he's trying to show his loyalty to the new king, right?
Yep.
But he questions David, or he questions Hushai's loyalty. Obviously, he's a little leery of this, right? Because he was loyal to David. Hushai replied in verse 18. Oh, I'm sorry. Hushai replied that he would follow the new king. In verse 18, the one chosen by the Lord, also chosen by the people and the men of Israel. In verse 19, he goes on to say, just as I served your father, so I will serve you.
Yeah, so I want to add in, we kind of jumped ahead and it probably was my fault because that is Hushai. Now we're talking about Hushai. You're talking when David was fleeing the city and he sent some people back. That was who we were talking about earlier. And
Yes, right.
Yeah, we skipped a lot. Well, we didn't skip a lot. We just put stuff in a little bit different order. So continue on.
Exactly. So Absalom asks Ahithophel, I can't say these names, for his advice, right?
Yep.
And in verse 21, he goes on to say, I advise that you sleep with your father's concubines. Israel will know then you've made yourself obvious to your father. So basically, he wanted to in full display up on the roof, make love to the concubines, and that's what he did.
So I'm going to add in my points that I brought up early on. So, as you noted, this all started down the demise with Bathsheba and David when he's on the roof, and he takes the poor man's everything and makes him his own. Bathsheba becomes his wife. At the end, when God said he's going to give away your wives and they will to ones that are close to you, he's given it to his son. And what is Ahithophel fell, whatever his advice is, sleep with your father's concubines, like you said, at the palace. So he does this on the roof in front of everybody in daylight. Right. Just the Lord said to tell him. So that's what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
There you go.
So
what comes around goes around.
Exactly.
So in verse 23, and I'm sort of ending the chapter here. In those days, Ahithophel's advice was like one who inquired of God.
Exactly.
That was interesting.
Yeah, he was, like I said, the great confidant, the advisor. And we left that a little bit, though. That's the reason why he sent Hushai with back to him, because he felt that Ahithophel, whatever his name is, was loyal to Absalom, not him. Yeah. And it's true.
Yeah. So, are these names getting harder? I really like the names Jacob and Joshua and Moses.
Yes, they are. They're getting harder.
There's no Steves in this.
Well, there's some Stevens eventually. So. Yeah.
Anything you want to add before we end?
No, it's just the beginning of the demise of David. So I did read a little bit ahead. There goes my voice.
Yeah.
I didn't see. I don't have no spoiler alert, but I don't think Absalom lasts very long. So that's all I know. So stay tuned to our next. Or I'm going to go on the assumption we're going to do the remainder, which is 24 chapters, right?
The last third. Yes.
So
the last third we will do.
I enjoyed it. Still like David, he did some bad things, proving he's human, proving to us that, again, if you don't stick to the Lord's plan, what happens? That's at least my takeaway. So
that's right. Steve, it's been a pleasure. Gatorade.
All right.
Cheers, man. Please like, subscribe, share. We love you joining us. Read the Bible. See you next time.
I'll come back now. You hear?
Oh, yeah.